As you see in the brochure that you received, the title of tonight's panel is Science and Islam. I want to play the bad guy tonight because right from this title, I have a lot of problems and a lot of questions. All the way more so to the subtitle. But when my term comes, I will say a few words, and I'm sure some of you may agree with me, some of you may disagree, but that's not the point. The point is to bring out different views and perspectives on something, on an issue which is crucial not only to science and also to Islam, but especially at this particular juncture, it is very important for Muslims and the Islamic world at a time that Islam and Muslims are unfortunately identified with a lot of extremist actions and terrorism from time to time. It is very important for us to understand the intellectual tradition of Islamic civilization, how rich it was, and the fact that it was, in fact, through Islam that ancient sciences were transferred to Western civilization. I won't take much time now. I would say my own comments later on. But for now, I want to start with introducing our first speaker, our keynote speaker, Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, who is a professor of nuclear and high-energy physics and teaches at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad in Pakistan. He received his BS and MS and PhD degrees all from MIT. He is also a recipient of the Baker Award for Electronics and the Abdul Salam Prize for Mathematics. In 2010, Dr. Hoodbhoy received the Joseph A. Burton Award from the American Physical Society and the Jean Meyer Award from Tufts University in Boston. In 2011, he was included in the list of 100 most influential global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. Over a period of 25 years, he has created and anchored a series of TV programs that dissected the problems of Pakistan's education system, and 2 other series that aimed at bringing scientific concepts to ordinary members of the public. He is the author of Islam and Science, Religious Orthodoxy, and the Battle for Rationality. Now, in 8 languages available. As the head of Mashal Books in Lahore, he leads a major translation project to produce books in Urdu that promote modern thought, human rights, and emancipation of women. In 2003, he was awarded UNESCO's Kalinga Prize for the popularization of science. He is a sponsor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and a member of the Permanent Monitoring Panel on Terrorism of the World Federation of Scientists. I'm pretty sure this is a summary of the CV of Dr. Hoodbhoy. It could have been pages and pages, and we had to summarize to take into consideration the limited time that we have. Dr. Hoodbhoy, please.
Should I speak to that?
However comfortable you are.
This way. Thank you, Dr. Faghfuri, and my thanks to the American Muslim Congress who invited me here, and in particular to Shakir Muhammad, with whom I had been in touch over the last couple of months. So it's a daunting task to talk about Islam and science in such a limited amount of time, but I would, it's obvious how important science is. It is the basis on which our modern civilization is constructed. And there's an infinite amount to be said about the relationship between religion and science, but I shall begin with some personal encounters. And so I'd like to be slightly autobiographical, at least in the beginning. When in 1973, I had finished my master's from MIT in physics, I went to Islamabad, which is not my hometown. My hometown is Karachi. And there I began my teaching career in physics. I met some wonderful physicists over there who were doing just regular, good physics, physics that would be recognized anywhere else in the world. But I also encountered a kind of shock when I saw the kind of physics that other people were doing. In particular, the chairman of my department had just published a paper in which he had calculated the speed at which heaven was running away from Earth. And he calculated it to be 1 centimeter per second less than the speed of light on the basis of Einstein's theory of relativity. There were others, not just in the department, but others in Pakistan, who had calculated such esoteric things as the temperature of hell, of the degree of munafiqat, which means hypocrisy in society using a form of Coulomb's law. And it quite worried me because, well, yes, these people were not well regarded by the colleagues who were doing sound science, but they did have quite a following. Well, then, 2 years later, I returned to MIT to do my PhD. And this was 1978 when I returned. I spent 3 years doing my PhD. When I returned, the world had changed. Pakistan had changed. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had been hung. And General Ziaul Haq, who had usurped power and declared himself to be the president of Pakistan, had set Pakistan on a new route, on a new path. And that path was the complete Islamization of all knowledge, including science. And so those people who had been more or less at the peripheries earlier on were suddenly propelled to the very center. They organized conferences, one of which I attended. Actually, I attended more than one, but this one was an international conference on the scientific miracles of the Holy Quran and Sunnah. Its objective being to prove that every conceivable physical fact that is known to modern science has already been known 1400 years ago. And so this spanned an enormous range of topics from embryology and medicine all the way up till engineering, astronomy, an explanation of comets, geology, and even physics. So one heard of how quantum mechanics and black holes had been anticipated as well. And one of the papers that I found most interesting was that of an engineer who headed the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission by the name of Sultan Bashiruddin Mahmud. Many, many years later, he was to meet Osama bin Laden to discuss the bomb. he had this rather interesting theory that when God made you and me, he made us out of clay, but he made the angels and the jinns out of fire. And so Mr. Mahmood proposed a very interesting way of solving Pakistan's energy problems, which is to capture the jinns and fire his energy. So that'll do the job. Well, you know, that was 1982, I think, that I went to that conference. It inspired my book, actually, which the title of which is Islam and Science, Religious Orthodoxy and the Battle for Rationality. But that was 82. And lots of things have happened in that time. But I'm afraid a lot of things have remained the same as well. So 2 months ago, I was at Peshawar University, and some students came. I went there to give a talk on physics. And some students came up to me and they said, "Sir, do you know about the proof now that the holy stone of the Kaaba, the Hajar-e-Aswad or Sang-e-Aswad, is something that modern science just didn't know about?" And then they told me something that they've read on the internet, that that an American had somehow disguised himself, walked to the Kaaba, and he had broken off a little piece of the holy stone. And then, before he could be apprehended, he had run away. And when they analyzed the stone in a laboratory, they found that it was putting out all kinds of alpha, beta, and gamma radiations. Hence, the proof that this was divine. I walked a little bit further, and another group of students apprehended me. And they said, "Dr. Hoodbhoy, do you know, do you believe in the Big Bang?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Well, do you know where the center of the Big Bang is?" Well, I tried to tell them that, look, Einstein's theory of general relativity, when you solve the equation, there's no center. It's the center is everywhere. Okay. So they said, "No, the center is in Makkah." So I said, "Hang on a bit. Makkah didn't even, you know how old the Earth is?" They said, "Tell us." I said, 4.5 billion years old. And the universe is 13.7 billion years. So the Earth didn't exist. And even much, much later, when it came into existence, it was a molten ball of matter. And there was no Makkah. Anyway, we talked a bit about that. But today, it's not just in Pakistan. All you have to do is go to the internet, and you will see the popular figures are today men like Harun Yahya, a man who says that evolution is a lie, and he amasses what he calls his data, junk, of course, which proves that evolution is wrong. You see men like Maurice Bucaille, he's dead now, enormously popular, a Frenchman who wrote this book called The Bible, the Quran, and Science, in which he proved that all science is in the Quran. The Bible's wrong, but the Quran's right. Okay, now you can believe that. Anyway, so it's across the board. A couple of years ago, I was on television with a rather well-known religious leader by the name of Maulana Ehtaramul Haq Thanvi, son of the famous Ehteshamul Haq Thanvi. And we were arguing, we were debating what had happened to science in Islam. And so the question came up, why is it that if all science is in the Quran, then how is it that the Christians, the Jews, the Hindus, they are way ahead of Muslims today? So he came up with an answer that was quite baffling. He said, all the science that there is in the Quran, but you have to search for it. And Muslims don't search for it well enough. They don't read it, and they don't read it with understanding. Okay? So I said, well, what about, the Jews and the Christians and everybody else? He says, this is what you don't know. You look at these scientists who are in the West, and before they go to bed, they read the Quran, and when they wake up, before going to their labs, they read it as well. I mean, it just blows your mind. Well, the sorry state of affairs is before us. After this brilliant period between the 9th and the 13th centuries, when the only people who were doing good science were the Muslims, you had these wonderful scientists. You had people like Jabir ibn Hayyan, you had people like Al-Khwarizmi, you had people like Ibn Haysham, and so forth, who laid the fundamentals of their subjects. You had the algorithm, you had algebra, you had the famous book Kitab al-Manazir, that book which Roger Bacon had used to do, and Francis Bacon had used to do experiments on optics. That was a wonderful golden period. 9th through the 13th century disappeared, but for the last 700 years, there's nothing to show. I think the last major Muslim figure who's considered a giant was Ibn Khaldun, and that's the 14th century. So what's happened in these 700 years? Why this period of utter darkness? And that is the real challenge. Our topic today is science and rationality. Well, I won't try and define rationality. I'll leave that to my colleagues over here who know so much more about philosophy and who study it professionally. All I know is that it's very hard to define things. Look, if you try to define a chair, if I try to define a chair, I'd get tied into knots. Okay, this chair is pretty simple. It's got 4 legs, but then there are chairs with just 1 leg, a bar stool, for example. There are chairs without backs. There are bean bags. There are all sorts of things. So how would I try to define a chair? I couldn't do it. Maybe you could. So still, we do have to have something. I do have to have something to say about rationality, and I'll just say it's the exercise of reason. We act rationally when we use reason rather than emotion, when we use objective facts rather than emotions. And you'll say, where are objective facts? Of course they're there. People argue, they say there's nothing objective, everything depends on the observer. Nonsense. Look, the sun always rises in the east, always sets in the west. And so that's an objective fact which every single person will agree upon. I've seen so many convoluted things based on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that if you watch something, it'll change, that the observer will change the state of the system. Yes, at the micro level, certainly. But the sun will rise in the east, set in the west, whether or not you look at it. Okay, we can talk about quantum mechanics later. So the essence of rationality, or the exercise of rationality in science, is the scientific method by which you observe, you see patterns, you look at those patterns and say, could there be something deeper? So you make a hypothesis. You say, all right, then if we assume this hypothesis, then can we make predictions? And if there are predictions and you go out and you observe them and you find it's right, then you say, okay, that hypothesis isn't wrong. If it's wrong, throw it out of the window and make a new hypothesis. So incrementally you get better. There are no absolute truths in science. No scientist will ever claim that unless he's a fool. So this is what gave us the modern world. The world with its cell phones, with its computers, with its lasers, with space travel, with everything, this, that, and that. Scientific truths, how are they established? You know, such a beautiful example is that of the Higgs boson, which they found just a few months ago. This was like looking for a needle that's been broken up into 1,000 little pieces and then throwing it into a haystack and then trying to reassemble all those pieces of the needle together. It was that difficult a thing. It took 12 years, 15 years, depending on how long you estimate it. And they could have at any point said, oh, we found it. We found it because, look, it has to be there. Because everything else is fitting in, and so it would be very inconvenient if it wasn't there. And yet, scientists actually spent billions and billions of dollars. They spent years and years of their time, and when the data came, it was, you should have seen how scientists pounced on it and said, you're wrong, you didn't do this right, you didn't do this right. Only when there was a consensus among scientists who belong to every part of the globe, who could have been Jews or Christians or Muslims or atheists or whatever, when they came to this common conclusion that the Higgs boson does exist, and it exists on this basis, then we said that it's there. Okay, but the ancient world didn't work this way. It didn't rely upon a consensus with people exercising rationality. You believed. You believed the great man. You believed the man who was who had a good reputation in society. You believed the man who said who had magical powers. You believed the man who said that he had a connection with God. You did not challenge. Those were the days when people believed in angels pushing the planets around. There was the Ikhwanul Safa. These were mystical Islamic thinkers who were good thinkers for their time. But in order to explain the motion of the planets, they had to invoke angels. Well, what else could you do? You didn't have the laws of motion at that time. You didn't have Newton's law of gravity. There's no concept of calculus or of differential equations. There was no way that you could predict the motion of the planets. And so the easier thing was, you assume that it's angels who are doing this job. You thought that sickness and health was because you were good or you were evil. Plagues came because a people had sinned, or earthquakes for that matter. That was the anger of the power up above. And by the way, this isn't just talk of 1,000 years ago. In 2005, there was this massive earthquake in Pakistan. And together with my students, I went there immediately after the earthquake to give relief supplies to those who had suffered. And 90,000 dead, and it was devastation all around. Well, the people were on their knees all the time. They had been told that it was their sin, that this was Qahr Illahi, this was the wrath of God. And so it was their sins that led to it. Now, there were interesting things. I mean, a thinking person would have reflected, and I have a couple of nice photographs on that. There's a mosque over there which has collapsed in like that, and there's a chai khana, there's a tea stall, which is fine. Well, it just depends on the local geology, depends upon the strength of the stone and so forth. But if someone asks, why is it that the mosque collapsed and the tea stall remained, that's a hard thing to explain. So, just after this earthquake, I was asked by Geo Television, which is one of the rather most widely viewed channel in Pakistan. And there were 3 mullahs over there. 2 were Sunni, 1 was Shia. And the issue was whether this was the wrath of God or not. And they gave their versions. The 2 of them said, yes, it was. The 3rd one said it was not, because the punishment can only occur while a prophet is alive, and since the last prophet has passed away, Prophet Muhammad, therefore this cannot be the wrath of God. However, it is a tambih, it is a warning. So it's a warning that don't stray from the true path, otherwise you'll get hit on the head. All right. So then the anchor comes and asks me, I said, look, I don't understand what they're saying, frankly, because the people who got killed were the poorest of the poor. They didn't even have an opportunity to sin. If you want to look at the sinners, they're all here in Islamabad. They're the guys who drink. They're the guys who, well, I don't know what else they do. Then furthermore, consider the fact that this earthquake came at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Friday in the month of Ramadan. And so everyone over there was fasting. They said, aha, but that's to tell them that they must do even better. All right. So then I say, my revered, my most honored religious ulema, I hear you, but tell me, why are there earthquakes on the moon? Who lives on the moon? So, we reached a kind of dead end over there. At the essence of doing science is the relationship between cause and effect. Why is there thunder? Because there's lightning. Why is there lightning? Well, we have an explanation, right? It's the separation of charges and at some point an electrical discharge. Why are the charges separated? Well, because the atmosphere drives air and causes ionization. Why does that happen? Well, because there's the sun's energy. And you can go layer after layer in the explanation. But you always have an explanation. And the ultimate explanation is codified in a bunch of formulae that can be written on the back of an envelope. I guess there's one person over here who understands that. I'm at least one person. But look, that's the ultimate, that's the Lagrangian of physics. So you have an explanation. Maybe you can't solve those equations of physics. Maybe you can't predict where earthquakes will happen, but you know why they happen, and there is a cause that leads to an effect. Let's go back now several hundred years, and this is to the time of Imam al-Ghazali, who died in the 12th century, 1100 and something. 1111. Thank you very much, sir. He was a man who was passionately opposed to the infiltration of Greek thought into Islamic civilization. That which had brought about the Islamic rationalists known as the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila were the ones who had done all that splendid work, or at least most of it. And here I will have to defer to the authorities who are on that side. But the Mu'tazila were the rationalists of Islam. They believed in cause and effect. And we know that Imam Ghazali was strongly opposed to them. And we know it particularly because a very great Muslim thinker by the name of Ibn Rushd, also known in the West as Avicenna.
Averroes.
Averroes, sorry, I'm sorry. Averroes, yes. Avicenna is Ibn Sina, yeah, Averroes. So Averroes. By the way, Averroes, is the only name that you find that is inscribed in the pantheon of names that's at MIT, written in stone. So you see his name there. So Averroes wrote a blistering critique of Al-Ghazali. And he said, here's what Al-Ghazali is saying. That if you eat bread, don't think that it's because of eating the bread that your stomach feels full. It's not that. It's actually God who's sending down angels and giving you the feeling of satiety. Don't think, says Averroes, that it's Ghazali who's saying this. Ghazali is saying that if I light a match and put it on a piece of cotton, don't think it is you're putting the match to the cotton that makes the cotton burn. It's actually angels and so forth. So deny causality. Things happen because of supernatural influences. He gave this beautiful example, Ghazali. He says, imagine there's a target and there's an arrow that's speeding towards it. You, as a human, cannot say that this will reach the target, even if the distance is this much or this much or this much. No matter how close it gets, you as a human do not have the wisdom, the knowledge, because that wisdom and knowledge resides only with Allah. And so you do not have the power of prediction. So it is the denial of causality and the trashing of science and mathematics that then went into Islamic tradition. It was a radical departure from the Mu'tazilite tradition. It was the ascendancy of this orthodoxy that destroyed rationality, that led to these 700 years of darkness, out of which it seems as if we're going to have a hard time getting out of. Well, at the heart of it all is what you do with miracles. See, miracles are a suspension of the laws of nature. And Muslim thinkers who have thought about this have struggled with this. Because in the 17th century, more in the 18th century, there were thinkers who were coming up, both in the Middle East and on the Indian subcontinent. They were grappling with this idea of how come the other civilizations have gone ahead so fast and we are left where we are. Not all of them thought in this way, but those who were politically enlightened and who wanted to now make a break with the past raised this question: what do you do about miracles? It was a very hard one. But it was one that Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who I think is the foremost rationalist amongst Indian Muslims and probably among Middle Eastern Muslims as well, he was a man who started out as a very conservative theologian. In fact, his very first paper was on the issue of whether the eating of mangoes is Islamic or not. See, it's not altogether a straightforward question. Because an ideal Muslim is he who does what the Prophet did and does no more than that. And so deviations, innovation, biddat, is considered bad. So this is a 30-page paper, not all of which I've read because it gets a bit tedious. But it's beautiful prose, Urdu prose. He concludes at the end that Muslim who does not eat mangoes because the Prophet hadn't. You see, the Prophet obviously couldn't have eaten mangoes because they don't grow in the desert. That Muslim who doesn't eat mangoes, for this reason, on the day of judgment, the angels will come and kiss his feet. So that's where he started from, but he went through an enormous intellectual transformation. He got convinced about the power of modern ideas of science, and he started a major translation work. He founded Aligarh Muslim University. He's one of the heroes of Pakistan, but they never talk about this aspect of his. He advocated a new approach to miracles. He said, look, I know that the Quran is the word of God, and I'm not going to argue with that. I know that everything that's in that is absolutely right, 100%. And yet, I am convinced of science. So, he then gave a prescription of how to combine the two. He said, what you have to do is an analysis of every word that's in the Quran that's relevant. Then you have to look at the context. You have to stretch things basically until the religion is in conformity with the science. And so on the specific issue of miracles, he said, they were there to teach dumb people. That they were allegorical, they didn't really happen, they're nice stories, but they're good stories, and so certainly they're not wrong, but you cannot interpret the Quran literally. That would be incorrect. Well, of course, that unleashed a storm. They say that there were 5,555 fatwas against him. He was declared as wajibul qatl, meaning deserver of death. But he's still a hero. Now, the amazing thing is that that thing has never been repeated. I mean, a reinterpretation of Muslim theology in this manner to make it consistent with science has never been done to the extent that he had. So today, we see this darkness, the absence of solid achievement in the sciences. After all, look, there's nothing around us that we see which has been invented by Muslims. Electricity? No. Computers? No. Antibiotics? No. This is nothing. And so this leads. It's not just a question of being left out. It also feeds into a sense of victimhood. You feel that the world is conspiring against you. The fact is that this decline had happened even before the time of maritime imperialism. Maritime imperialism, the French, the Portuguese, the French, the British, much later the Americans. That was so much later. So the question is, can science be revived in Islam again or not? Look, it doesn't help to appeal to ancient glories. Al-Razi was a great physician. Ibn Sina wrote the canon of medicine. Marvelous, but that's 800 years ago, 900 years ago. You just can't keep talking about that. Anytime I put in Google, Islam and science, I just get that. Nothing else to show. So, what's the way out? There's got to be a philosophical change. There's got to be a change in the way that Muslims think. And the first element of that is give up the idea that there's direct interference by God into the matters of the world. If you think that praying for rain will get you rain, well then keep praying. It still won't rain. If you think that praying to stop an earthquake will stop an earthquake, well keep doing it. The Japanese build buildings which are on rollers. We just keep building the way we've always built them. So, do what Galileo said when he wrote this letter to the Duchess of her name was Christina. He said, the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, but science tells us how the heavens go. So do that. Separate the two. Deen, dunya, the world and faith. Separate them. They can live comfortably with each other. Can they? Can't. They can't. There's no way. Once you start overlapping, then the problems arise. So separate them. What this means is that we've got to change the nature of Muslim education. Look at the curricula of the madrasas, the religious seminaries. It hasn't changed in 1,000 years, and that's literally true. In some madrasas, they still, at least until 40 years ago, they were still teaching the geocentric version of astronomy. It's the earth at the center, everything else moves around it. In fact, the rector of Makkah University, a man by the name of Sheikh Ibn al-Baz, he had written a book whose title in Arabic was, if I can remember it, Jiryan al-Shams wa Qamar wa Sukut al-Arz. So it's the stationarity of the earth and the motion of the sun and the moon around it. Well, you're not going to have science if you have people like that. So if we want science, we'll have to open up Muslim societies and recognize that not only is the physical domain different from the metaphysical domain, but also that a society that is based upon rigidity cannot ever nurture science. Look, the only two Muslims who have got the Nobel Prize in the sciences, the first is no longer a Muslim. He's now declared to be a heretic. His name is Abdus Salam. He got the Nobel Prize in 1979. A Pakistani who, together with two others, Steven Weinberg and Sheldon Glashow, created what is called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. It's a theory that has held up to every test. It's something that we begin with. It's something that was at the basis of the discovery of the Higgs boson. It's something that lets us know what happened in the earlier stages of the universe. That man, who came from an ordinary Pakistani village, made it to the very, very top. But 1974, he is legislated together with his community as being a heretic. He died a very unhappy man. But so he was so in love with his country, he wanted his body to be buried in Pakistan. Where it is buried, no government functionary came to receive him. His tombstone has been desecrated. That's the level of intolerance that we have. I could tell you personal experiences. There's no time for that. I could tell you about my neighbor who was murdered. One through his neck, one through his heart. I took his body to the hospital. He died in my car. What was his crime? He was an Ahmadi. If we don't open up Muslim societies, there's not a hope in hell that we'll get out of the Dark Ages. Not a hope in hell. So to conclude, there is drastic need for change. Is that change coming? Well, look, until 50 years ago, the slope was positive. We were moving upwards. And then came this dip. So I'd say roughly around the middle of the 20th century, that came that dip, just after decolonization. Why did it come? Because those secular modernist governments that were in place in places like, say, Iran, in Indonesia, in Egypt, they were torpedoed. They were destroyed from below by, guess who? The Western powers. Why? They wanted oil. They wanted natural resources. And so, one after the other, they fell. What took their place? Well, Hamas, the fundamentalists in every country. Why did it come about? Yes, the failure of secular governments, their corruption and all that, but it was also the deliberate destruction by the West for very narrow reasons. That's a long discussion, no time. Let's hope that this blip is a very temporary one. And let's hope that Muslims take their rightful place among peoples of the world, that they become like others. They have such a wonderful tradition, so much to look back towards, and it's time now to look forward. Thank you.
We leave the questions to the end because so many issues came up, and this lecture actually shows the very interconnectedness of different fields of science, from hard sciences to theology to law to philosophy and whatnot. And therefore, each of these issues that the speaker raised have to be addressed one by one. And I thought it would be better to hear the other two speakers and then come up with questions and answers. Before I introduce the second speaker, we should also be thankful to the American Islamic Congress, for organizing these sort of panels. I believe this is the third one that is being organized. AIC is a non-profit, non-religious civil society development organization serving Muslim and non-Muslims by promoting civil and human rights through advocacy, engagement, and education. The Project Noor is in fact a student-led project advocating social justice by empowering responsible leaders to cultivate an environment of acceptance and mutual respect because Muslims and all communities, between Muslims and all communities. Project Noor achieves this mission by fulfilling the following 5 goals, which you can read more about on this page. I believe these are those 5 goals. Science and Islam is a groundbreaking series of dialogue analyzing the intersection of Islamic faith and science. Dialogues held at college campuses across the country address issues like creation, evolution, and extraterrestrial life. A panel of prominent Muslim scientists, along with students and other audience members, explore Muslim perspectives on science and discusses how Muslim Americans grapple with some of the scientific advancements of today. This is a very noble undertaking, and we should all be thankful to AIC and institutions like that. The more we have institutions like this in this country, especially now that, as I mentioned, the face and reputation of Islam has been presented in a very negative way, there's still more need to have institutions like this. The second speaker is a very young but quite accomplished scholar from University of California, Berkeley, Professor Asad Ahmed. He's an associate professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He received his PhD with distinction from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University in New Jersey in 2007. Dr. Ahmed specializes in early Islamic social history and Islamic intellectual history, with a special focus on rationalist sources. He has authored several books and published numerous articles in the field of Islamic rationalism, including philosophy, logic, and theology in international journals and collected volumes. Dr. Ahmed currently chairs the Mellon seminars called Greco-Arabic Rationalism in Islamic Transmitted Sciences. The post-classic period, and he's also the editor-in-chief of the Oxford series in post-classical Islamic history. Dr. Ahmed.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I want to begin by thanking the American Islamic Congress for inviting me to this very important event and for hosting such important and useful gatherings. And I also, of course, want to especially thank Shakir and Martin for organizing it and making things very, very easy and simple and facilitating matters for us. And, of course, finally, also I want to thank my co-panelists because I'm looking forward to a very fruitful discussion. So, let me say a couple of things about myself, and I'll be very, very brief. I have a lot of things to say, and I'm going to try to finish, and I will finish in my allotted 40 minutes or so. I work mainly on Islamic social and intellectual history. I'm a historian of ideas and of culture. And my way of thinking about the modern world and the contemporary world is determined by what happened in history. And there are two angles from which we have to look at history. One of them is presumably what happened in history, and the other one is what we're told happened in history. In other words, presumed facts and narratives, right? And I think, in fact, the latter, narratives, are more important than what actually happened because they determine the way we think about ourselves, the way other things think about us, and that helps us also to carve a trajectory for the future. So one has to have a source-critical approach. When one looks at the sources, one doesn't take it at face value. One goes deep into the sources to try to weed out hagiographies, for example, and tendentiousness and so on, and tries to write responsible history. Generally, my work is deeply invested in technical texts in various languages. I read works in formal logic from the medieval period, in Arabic and in Greek and so on, and in philosophy and theology, astronomy, mathematics, and so on. And generally, I sit in my office or in manuscript libraries, or I sit with my small group of colleagues, one of whom is in the back, who knows, who's one of the few people who reads my work, so In other words, I'm trying to reconstruct a narrative of what really happened in Islamic history. And when I was invited by the American Islamic Congress, I considered this to be a very important opportunity because what we're talking about is very important. A larger, intelligent audience who are not specialized in a particular field should know about what we specialists are doing in the field. So basically, this is my little spiel on the significance of the subject. What I'm trying to say is very important to look at the history of Islamic rationality before the contemporary period, so that we may then understand what really happened and how we got to the contemporary period. And in light of the narratives that we construct and in light of what may have happened, we may then carve out a story for the future. So let me begin by saying that I agree with Professor Hoodbhoy that one needs a space for science in Islam. There has to be a distinction between metaphysics and everything else. That's certainly true. I also absolutely agree that the state of rationalist sciences in the Islamic tradition, generally speaking, with the exception of some places, is pretty deplorable. One, for example, study of formal logic and mathematics and so on and so forth, and physics is in a terrible state. And I also agree that something needs to be done about all of that. So we're on the same page on these matters, and I want to be very explicit about this point. I'm in complete agreement. I'm afraid that, and I say this with all due respect, for the rest, practically everything else that was said, other than anecdotes, I completely disagree. And I disagree on the basis of my investigation of texts. For example, and I'm not going to get into a lot of these things because I have a different lecture prepared, but I have to make some comments to set the stage. To begin with, the idea that that Muslims anticipate science in the Quran is something that is unique, is problematic. If you go and type Bible and science on the internet, you'll find the same stuff. Except that, of course, in the Muslim case, it is true that the numbers are much greater. So it's a phenomenon that's actually global. It's an issue of the percentages that's different. The narrative that we were told about the Golden Age and the post-classical period, I'm afraid, is entirely wrong. And I'm going to get into detail. Some of them will be technical because I want to show evidence. The theory of what science is and what the scientific method is, I'm afraid, is also deeply problematic. The use of categories like seminaries and clerics and mullahs and so on is specific to the Catholic tradition. They presuppose certain hierarchies of the church, certain actions of the church, such as having edicts and councils. This is something that does not apply to the Islamic tradition. We cannot use these conceptual categories to talk about Islam. The idea that the denial of causality will destroy science is also problematic because the Muslim tradition actually says, the mainstream Sunni tradition says, that there is certainly no causality, but there is something called secondary causality. In other words, it's a domino effect that you can accept. The other thing they say is that even though God is interfering in the world, He does it according to a habit. And all you need for science is regularity. The commitment that there is a cause and effect relationship does nothing for your scientific enterprise. As long as you assume that there's a regularity in nature, it may be God intervening, or it may be, something immediately effecting a change. It's a commitment. It's a metaphysical commitment to say something is causal. In fact, here's a quick demonstration. I'm going to take this pen, I'm going to throw it. Did anybody see causality there? No, what you saw is concomitance of a certain action and another action. So what we have here, and this is, by the way, not me talking, this is actually certain critiques of modern philosophy of science, including David Hume, whom I will mention along the way. So what we have here are a lot of problems. I don't want to get deep into it because we'll have a question and answer session. And I do say all of these because I have met Professor Hoodbhoy this morning, and I consider us to be friends, and this is a frank discussion, and the subject is very important. If we have a misunderstanding of what really happened and what the concepts of science are and what the categories are, then we're not going to solve a problem which is real. The problem is real. There is a deplorable state of rationalism in the Islamic tradition today, and we have to fix it somehow. So let's get into the structure of my talk. The first thing I'll talk about is the existing narrative, which Dr. Hoodbhoy kindly has laid out for me, so that'll be an easy task. I'm going to tell you what the existing narrative is. In the next section of my talk, I'm going to talk about the Muslim conceptualization of the rationalist and scientific enterprise precisely for the so-called Dark Ages, from the 12th to the early 20th centuries. I'm not going to get into too many technical details. I welcome you to ask me questions about advances in astronomy and mathematics and logic and so on and so forth during the so-called Dark Ages. I'll be happy to give you some tidbits along the way. But here I'm going to talk mainly about how Muslim scholars thought about the scientific enterprise, right? And we'll have very, very explicit examples. I will then turn to talk about, you might all wonder after I give you the examples, who these so-called Muslim scholars were. So I'm going to give you their profiles so that we can be very clear about who these people were. And then finally, we'll have some conclusions about the past, present, and future, which I'll sort of leave open, actually, because that's something we need to talk about once the matter has been contextualized. So let me begin by talking about the existing narrative. The story that we were told is that in the golden age of Islam, the story begins that there is a translation movement that begins in the 8th century with enlightened caliphs. This translation movement leads to the appropriation of Greek and Indian and Pahlavi and Sasanian sciences and so on and so forth in the Islamic tradition. Things are absorbed and translated into Arabic. Then there's a process of naturalization and appropriation by Muslim scholars. And during the Golden Age, these people are rationalists. They study philosophy and so on and so forth. And then before 1111, when Ghazali dies, this man, Ghazali, who is sort of the paragon or the climax of the clash between rationality and traditionalism or orthodoxy, which is, by the way, another conceptually problematic term because it presumes certain edicts and councils of the Catholic Church, but I wouldn't get into that at this point. Something happens, the climax comes with Ghazali, who dies in 1111. This theologian writes a book called The Destruction of the Philosophers, in which he takes issue with rationalism and pretty much destroys it. From this point on, and we have heard about Ghazali from Dr. Hoodbhoy, so you have been introduced to him. From this point on, basically there's an unstoppable tsunami of traditionalism, a rise of traditionalist scripturalism, literalism in the Islamic tradition, the climaxes of which we are seeing today. That's basically the story that I rehearsed for you. That's what it is. Let's actually look at Ghazali now. Let's actually read the text. Here's Ghazali's attack in the Tahafut, which, by the way, I deliberately use the translation destruction. Tahafut is actually a very explicit term. It means something that buckles under its own weight. It's not to go out. In the Latin world, when they translated the term, they called it destructio. It's not a destruction. It is when you put too much weight on something and it buckles under its own weight. As you're going to see, Ghazali's argument is not with Muslim science. It's with the impossibility of logic proving metaphysics. He basically is going to argue, as you're going to see in the quotes, that when you use logical arguments to prove metaphysics, you're going to fail. Your syllogisms are going to fail. Your premises are not going to lead to the syllogisms, and hence the tahafut is going to happen. The thing is going to buckle under its own weight and it's going to fall down. That's what the tahafut is. Anyway, here's a quote, the so-called attack of Ghazali. "We have transmitted this story of the philosophers to let it be known that there is neither firm foundation nor perfection in the doctrine they hold, that they judge in terms of surmise and supposition without verification or certainty, that they use the appearance of their mathematical and logical sciences as evidential proof for the truth of their metaphysical sciences, using this as a gradual enticement of the weak of the mind." What he's taking issue with is the inability of philosophers to prove metaphysical truths. Right? When the philosophers talk about the creation of the world and they talk about the unity of God and God's attributes and so on, this is what he's taking issue with. Let's keep going. This is what he says about religion and the rationalist sciences. "Had the philosophers' metaphysical sciences been as perfect in demonstration, free from conjecture as their mathematical, they would not have disagreed among themselves regarding the former, namely metaphysics, just as they have not disagreed in their mathematical sciences. The second part of their doctrine, namely the philosopher's doctrine, is one that does not clash with any religious principle. It is not necessary for believing in the prophets and God's messengers to dispute with philosophers. An example of the kinds of things philosophers say is the following. The lunar eclipse consists in the obliteration of the moon's light due to the interposition of the earth between it and the sun, the earth being a sphere surrounded by the sky on all sides. Right? So he's describing an eclipse. What happens in an eclipse is precisely what he's telling you. A body interposes, a spherical celestial body interposes itself between the sun and the moon, and you get an eclipse. This is what the philosophers say. And so he goes on to say, this topic is also one into the refutation of which we shall not plunge, since this serves no purpose. Whoever thinks, and this is important, whoever thinks that to engage in a disputation for refuting such a theory is a religious duty, harms religion and weakens it." Is this point clear? I hope what Ghazali is saying is getting clearer and clearer to you, right? If you get into a dispute with philosophers about eclipses, you're actually harming religion. Leave them alone. For these matters rest on demonstrations. He's saying what the philosophers are showing you are actually demonstrations. They are geometrical and mathematical demonstrations, and they leave no room for doubt. Okay, so this is Ghazali. Next thing, now on the clash of scripture and science. What happens when scripture clashes with science? This is what Ghazali says. If it is said that God's messenger said, so if the prophet said the following, and you get this report about the prophet, he says, the sun and moon are two of God's signs that are eclipsed neither for the death nor life of anyone. Should you witness such events, then hasten to the remembrance of God and prayer. Right? If this is what the prophet said, how then does this agree with what the philosophers say? So somebody's asking this hypothetical question. If the prophet said that the sun and the moon are not being eclipsed because somebody died, how is this disagreeing with what the philosophers are saying? Sorry, how is this agreeing with what the philosophers are saying? Ghazali says, we say, there is nothing in this that contradicts what the philosophers have stated, since there is nothing except the denial of the occurrence of the eclipse for the death or life of anyone and the command to pray. Why should prayer be seen to contradict the demonstrations of the philosophers? All the prophet's statement is saying is when you see it, just pray. He's not giving you any physical proof or argument for why eclipses are happening. This is no disagreement here with what the philosopher is saying. And then he continues, and this is very, very important. If it is said at the end of this tradition that the prophet added something and said, and the prophet presumably, let's say, said more things, he said, but if God reveals himself to a thing, it submits itself to him, thereby proving that the eclipse is submission by reason of revelation, we answer, the tradition is not soundly transmitted, right? So if you say that the prophet is saying that the reason for the eclipse is that the sun and the moon are submitting themselves to God, then leave the tradition, because science does not tell you that. Reject the tradition, say that this is not a sound tradition from the prophet. In other words, the authority is actually being given to science, not to religion, not to reports. Okay, I hope this point is very clear. Yes? People are nodding, very good. Okay. So what is the room for science? Here's what Ghazali says. Is there any room for science? He says, the greatest thing in which the atheists rejoice is for the defender of religion to declare that these astronomical demonstrations and their alike are contrary to religion. The inquiry at issue about the world is whether it originated in time or is eternal. He's saying this is the metaphysical issue. Moreover, once this temporal origination is established, it makes, and this is important, it makes no difference whether it is a sphere, a simple body, an octagon, or a hexagon. It makes no difference whether the highest heavens and what is beneath are 13 layers, or as they say, or lesser or greater. Metaphysics has nothing to do with these issues. They are investigated in other disciplines. As for metaphysics, we will make it plain that what the philosophers set down as a condition of the truth of the matter of the syllogism is something they have not been able to fulfill in their metaphysical sciences. So he's saying, go out, do your sciences, create as many models of the world as you like, astronomical models and so on and so forth. This will do nothing to your religion. All you have to do when it comes to metaphysics is don't try to prove matters related to metaphysics, right? In fact, he's creating a very neat separation between what we call science and, religion, right? This is what we wanted. So this is what Ghazali did. So here's a quick summary of what we have learned from actually looking at Ghazali. He's saying that the principles of logic are sound in themselves. The failure of the philosophers is in the field of metaphysics, not in medicine, not in mathematics, and nothing else. When they deal with religion and try to prove religion, that's when they make an error. It's not when they're doing medicine and so on. They can have as many models of the world as you like. We're going to see some models, okay? Demonstrations based on reason in all sciences except metaphysics must be accepted. In fact, we saw that when there are such demonstrations, transmitted religious texts that clash with these demonstrations must be rejected as unsound. Science has a higher authority than religion. This failure of the rationalists is grounded in their inability to be true to their own rational principles. His issue with the rationalists is that they do metaphysics and they fail to prove what they want to prove on the basis of logic. That's what the tahafud is. That's what the destruction is. And the other point I'm going to mention now, but I'm going to prove it through other examples. He also says what the other sciences deduce about the world makes no difference in the matter of religion. In other words, he's alluding to a development that's going to happen in the next century. Namely, the meaning is that such sciences are providing models for understanding the world, and they're not doing anything more. And this is precisely what science does. It gives you models for understanding the world on the basis of observation and reasoning and so on and so forth. Right? Let's talk about, is everybody with me so far? Yes, very good. Let's actually look at some models. What are these models that he's talking about? In the year 168, a great man died called Ptolemy. he had used certain ideas of astronomy and certain models presented before him by a man called Hipparchus. And Ptolemy set down a certain model of the universe which had predictive capacity for the station of the stars and the planets as close as you can get at that time. And this model was accepted for the next 1400 years, well, almost. It is a geocentric model, a model where the Earth is at the center of the universe and other things are revolving around it, right? Everybody clear on the model? Yes? So he says, okay, he has an instrumentalist model of the world. In other words, what he wants from his model is to have predictive capacity. If I get up next week and I look at the sky, his model should be able to tell me that the Mercury is going to be over there and the moon is going to be over there and so on and so forth, right? So you need a certain model. And what Ptolemy had done is he had run into a bit of a problem because the Earth being at the center of the universe is not really going to give you things that are going to have predictive capacity, but he wanted that. So he proposed different ways of thinking about the universe. He said the first thing he did is that he had these things called deferents and epicycles. Is this working? Oops. Okay. Here's the observer O. Sorry, let me talk about this one. Here's the center of this black circle, right? So T is the center of the circle, the dark circle. This circle around it is called an epicycle, which has a center here. So basically what he's saying, this, by the way, is a simplified model of the movement of the sun. So he's saying, if you assume that this is the Earth, and this is a point, and this point is moving this way at a certain velocity, and the sun is going around this point, meaning making this kind of motion at a certain velocity, you'll be able to make a prediction about where the sun is going to be, and actually he's pretty good at predicting it. He said, if you don't want that, I'll give you another model. You take this as the Earth, and you set up this point off center, and you make a circle around that center. So this red circle is where the sun is going to be, and now it's going to move like this, getting closer and farther from the Earth as it moves around, and that's also going to give you the same predictive capacity. In other words, Ptolemy, what he did is that he's not committing to himself to a cosmology. He's not committing to himself to saying that a world looks a certain way. He's offering you predictive capacity. This is basically what the Muslims lived with. This is the Ptolemaic system that they adopted with this geocentric model of the world. Now, another thing I wanted to point out, because this is significant for what happens in astronomy in the Muslim world, is another thing that Ptolemy introduced was something called an equant. One of the problems we have for the motion of Jupiter is that you have to have a movement around a circle, which movement has to be uniform, because Aristotle had said that heavenly bodies move with a uniform motion around the Earth. Well, we know the planets don't, but he has to use uniform motion and show the planets will be at a certain point at a certain time. So he said, okay, the Earth is here. Here is a point around which there is a circle. There is an epicycle here. You guys know these terms now. And we're going to measure the uniform motion of this thing moving around like this with a reference to this thing called an equant. And when you do that, if it's moving uniformly around the equant, but when you do that from the perspective of somebody on the Earth, it's going to look like it's moving at different speeds. Okay? So he has fulfilled Aristotelian cosmology and, of course, has given you predictive capacity. In other words, what Ptolemy was doing was giving you with different models for being able to predict where the planets are going to be in different times. Now, the problem with Ptolemy, and this is going to be very important for understanding Muslim theories of science, is that he violated a lot of principles of Aristotle. Principles such as Aristotle wanted planets to move in a uniform motion. You cannot go fast and slow, which is actually what happens, right? We know from modern astronomy. So you need uniform motion, and Aristotle, by the way, proved these things with pretty good rigor as a philosopher, and we all know Aristotle's rigor. So, we were stuck with that cosmology. The other thing he wanted is that he wanted homocentric circular motion. You cannot have different points with different circles around them. You need the Earth at the center, and you need that center to be the center of everything else. So basically he has embedded spheres. And the third thing Aristotle wanted is that he wanted the planets to be simple. They cannot be divisible. They cannot have different parts or different circles. And as you can see from the models I've shown you, the predictive capacity for the movement of the planets required a measurement of relative speed around multiple equants, right? So this is a violation of principle 1 and 3. And it meant establishment of spheres with centers other than the Earth. That is, say, epicycles that you have met, and eccentrics. This is a violation of 2 and 3. And basically, for the rest of the period of classical and post-classical period of Muslim astronomy, Muslim astronomers were actually struggling with this problem. They're committed to Aristotle, And at the same time, they want to have predictive capacity. And now they have to deal with all these different models. And they're presenting new ones. Every astronomer worth his salt gave you a new model for understanding the universe. There are many, many models of astronomy, starting already from the late 8th century, going all the way into the 16th and 17th centuries. Muslim astronomers, contrary to popular belief, did not retain the Earth as the center of the universe due to religious doctrine. It's not because it's the Quran, it's because of Aristotle. That's why they kept it that way. And the other thing that people do not point out is that actually philosophers and astronomers such as Biruni of the 10th century, 13th century Katibi, 15th century Qushi actually did toy with the idea of the sun being at the center and the Earth moving around. They just didn't have the mathematical tools which they were developing to have the predictive capacity. And by the way, these models were actually, the better models were presented by Ibn al-Shatir, whom we're going to see for just a second, which had a direct impact. You can actually prove that Ibn al-Shatir's model actually is directly responsible for the Copernican heliocentric theory. You should read George Saliba on this. It's actually been documented. Actually, a colleague of mine is working on the Jewish intermediaries between Ibn al-Shatir and Copernicus in Italy, okay? So this is basically pretty well documented. So what I'm trying to say here, let me just give you one more slide and then make my point about models. In the 14th century, there's an astronomer called Ibn Shatir, and he's struggling with the problems I've told you about. You want to keep Aristotle, and you want predictive capacity, so he gets rid of eccentrics and equants. He cannot get rid of epicycles, as you can see here, right? Those are still there, but he's getting better at it. And he presents the same model for the movement of all the planets except Mercury. The only difference among the models is that some of them are moving at one velocity and other ones are moving at other velocities, and some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. It is this idea that was picked up by Copernicus. What he did, all you have to do at that point, when you have this shared model of different planets, you take out the Earth from the center, put it around the sun, put the sun at the center, and you will actually, with some tweaking, you actually get the heliocentric model. Again, read George Saliba and David King on this. Okay, so this has all been documented. What's happening at this point is that we have a bunch of planetary models that are emerging. And the attitude of the Muslim astronomers is the following. They understand astronomy as providing mathematical models. They do not, they know that it's very difficult to understand what the world actually looks like. What we have are observations. We have models and predictive capacity. Any number of them can accomplish the task, and you have to pick from among them. This is precisely what scientific theory is. You have observations, you have hypotheses, and you test them, and you work with them. That's exactly what they're doing. The thing is, in fact, they're better philosophers than some philosophers than some scientists are today. They know that these are theories and these are models. Shirazi, a very, very famous astronomer, presented 9 models for the equant of Mercury, and they would provide the exact same predictive capacity. He did pick one in the end because it was more simple, but he was happy presenting more. Khafri, another astronomer, basically famously said that all models are mathematically equivalent. So let me give you, so basically what I'm trying to say is the attitude towards science in the so-called dark ages is, number one, they're doing terrific astronomy. They're providing models. These models are going to be central to the emergence of the heliocentric theory. And these are philosophically rather, impressive, brilliant ideas about what science is, what the scientific enterprise is. What we do are we give models, in science. Let me give you a theologian's point of view on this, and then we're going to do a summary and move forward, because I know my time is going to run out soon. Aduddin al-Iji, who died in 1351, who was an Ash'ari theologian, same brand as Ghazali, whose text on theology, al-Mawaqif, is actually the standard Ash'ari text read in madrasas even to this day. He has the following to say. He talks about various, astronomical models and so on, and then this is what he says. He says about the models. He says, these are imagined things and have no existence in the external world. But there is no objection to things like this. In other words, he's defending astronomy at this point, this hardcore Ash'ari theologian. Nor are there things related to matters of creed, nor indeed can one definitively confirm or falsify these things. And this is actually important. We're going to see that modern theory of science actually does the same thing. We mention them only so that you may understand the astronomer's intentions. If you see these things as mere models, thinner than the house of spider, listening to these words would not do you any harm. Take them as models. This is mathematics that's going on. Don't worry about your religion. Go on and make your models. His commentator, Sharif al-Jurjani, actually made a slight difference. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he basically says, yes, these things are models, but mathematics is real. If you posit a sphere, it will have certain properties and certain other properties and so on. In other words, if you posit various spheres moving at various velocities, set up in a certain fashion, you're going to have a certain mathematical reality. So there is a mathematically real thing that's going on here. They're not just spider webs that are being woven out. Again, the idea here is that, the point I keep on stressing is that they believe that mathematical models, science, astronomy, medicine, and so on, these are ways of understanding the world. One can do them as long as they do not infringe on metaphysics, which you cannot prove anyway. That becomes a matter of belief. You leave that outside. So here's a quick summary. I think I have about 10 minutes left. From Ghazali onwards, there are some important shared attitudes to the rationalist scientific enterprise. Number one, the rationalist enterprise is built on premises from which one deduces conclusions by means of methods established in logic. We saw this in Ghazali already, sorry. In various fields, observation is a requirement for the production of scientific knowledge. When the demonstrations of the rationalist disciplines differ from the pronouncements of transmitted religious texts pertaining to the subject matter of these disciplines, the scriptural proofs have to be reinterpreted or considered unauthentic. Chuck them out. When the prophets, when you get something from the prophet and it says, the moon and the sun eclipse because they're bowing before God, and demonstration of astronomy tells you something else, don't believe what the prophet said. Say it's false. Fields like astronomy, medicine, logic, etc. provide us with models which may or may not correspond to reality. These models have an intelligible reality, right? They're internally consistent systems. What they're talking about, they think of models as systems. When you set things up a certain way, with a certain equation, with a certain velocity, yes, they're internally consistent, and that's what they are. Since we are only talking about models, their predictive capacity does not mean that there is a real or causal relation between the model and reality. This is a way of separating and freeing science from any commitment to metaphysics. You can have science. Okay, and let me make a couple of comments now. I think about 8 minutes left. This is something I don't like doing. The Islamic tradition has to be understood on its own terms, from its own texts. And comparing them to the Western model actually grafts certain expectations on it and so on. But I do want to do this because I want you to realize that these ideas that what we're dealing with are systems and models is actually something that's embraced by modern philosophers of science. Hume, for example, who's not so modern, but certainly Popper, they say the following about induction and the problem of verification. Here's an example. You have an observation, the following one. For the past 40 years, whenever it is Sunday, I found Professor X in church, right? You have gone to church for the past 40 years. Every Sunday, you find Professor X in church. Your conclusion you want to draw on the basis of this repeated observation that you might want to draw is that in future Sundays, I will find Professor X in church. It sounds pretty reasonable, right? This is induction. You have come up with a general universal proposition on the basis of your assessment of particular cases. The problem, as Hume tells you, and also as Popper will tell you, is that you cannot verify a universal proposition except through a circular method. What is going to justify this conclusion that on future Sundays I find Professor X in church? Well, a proposition of the following sort. Whenever, over the course of 40 years, you find someone in church on Sunday, you can conclude that on future Sundays that person will be in church. You need that general proposition for that induction to be true. And how do you prove that? Well, you have to make an observation over 40 years, and in those cases, after 40 years, the person has to be coming to church. This is circular. So induction actually does not give you universal propositions. It's incomplete. And this is also what the Muslim philosophers are saying. You can observe all you want. You're constructing these models. The models are equivalent. This is what allows you to do science. It's not going to harm your religion. There's also a problem with falsification. Popper certainly believed in the theory of falsification, but Quine, who came after him, and I think personally that he's a more brilliant philosopher than Popper, but maybe we may disagree, he believes that falsification is indeterminate. When, for example, I have an observation that does not sit well with my theory, that does not give me the prediction that my theory had given, you cannot say that it has falsified a particular theory. What it has done is that it's falsified an entire system. Right? So, for example, I say that the sun is going to be over there at 4 p.m. tomorrow, and it doesn't show up there. I don't know which part of my hypothesis of my system is incorrect. It might be theory A, theory B, hypothesis A, hypothesis B. What you can do is you can falsify entire systems, and you can verify entire systems. You have basically one of two choices in science. You have to accept that what you have are hypotheses that are auxiliary and supportive of other hypotheses. You have an observation that doesn't work with your system, and you have one of two choices. Either you check out the entire system and start again, or you maybe go with minimal disturbance and pick out a hypothesis that's not going to make a lot of disturbance. But this is also a metaphysical commitment. Right? So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Modern philosophers of science have a similar attitude towards science and models and verification and induction and so on that these Muslim astronomers and scientists had. I'm going to skip this one because I probably have now 5 minutes of that. I have more examples all the way going up to 1921, including among scholars, sort of, in fact, almost sort of slightly pseudo-scholars who have the same attitude towards science, such as Ahmed Raza Khan Barelvi. I'm not going to give his quotation, but let me move on to, if you're wondering who are these scholars, am I not talking about astronomers? Aren't these guys being, bullied and being chased around by mullahs, by these religious fanatics? Let's look at them. Who are they? Here are the profiles. Ghazali, Ash'ari theologian, jurist, mystic, philosopher. He wrote a book called Maqasid al-Falasifa, The Aims of the Philosophers. He's a brilliant logician, by the way. Tusi, whom I did not get into. Astronomer, theologian, his Tajreed al-I'tiqad is still read in the Qum seminary in Iran today. So he's an important theologian. Some people call him a marja, a person you go to get your theological and juristic answers. He's a logician, philosopher, and ethicist. Katibi is a logician, philosopher, and astronomer. Ibn al-Shatir, the guy who actually helped Copernicus indirectly, is an astronomer, mathematician. He's a mosque timekeeper. The guy's job is he sits in the Damascus mosque, Umayyad mosque in Damascus, and he keeps time for you as a religious duty. E.G. is a logician. We met him. Theologian, Shirazi, the guy who said that you can have 9 models, is an astronomer. He's an important Quran commentator. He writes commentaries on the Quran. These guys, what I'm trying to say, these divisions between an orthodoxy and religious fanaticism and the rationalists who are being chased around and being beaten up, this is a false dichotomy. And the reason for that is the following. What did the Muslims study in their curricula, in the madrasa, this horrible madrasa? Here's a list of the Dars-e-Nizami, which has been watered down in the past 50, 60 years in South Asia. From 1750 approximately to about 1920, this is what their number of books were being read. In grammar, there are 12. Rhetoric, there are 2. Philosophy, there are 3. Logic, there are 11 books. Formal mathematical logic. Theology, there are 3. Jurisprudence, there are 2. Principles of jurisprudence, there are 3. Traditional sciences, Traditions of Muhammad, only 1 book. That's what they're reading. Quranic exegesis, only 2 books. Astronomy, 5 books. Medicine, 3 books. And mysticism, 1. This is not the curriculum of a religious fanatic. So, here are the conclusions, basically. I know I'm pretty much out of time at this point, but I want to make some general conclusions. What we have learned is that the contemporary world is certainly, in the Islamic world, there is a deplorable state when it comes to rationalism and science. We are in terrible shape. Something needs to be fixed. But the narrative that we have been given, that there was a decline in rationalism from Ghazali onwards, which has come to climax now, and this is the fruit. These are the fruit that we have sown, reaped from the germ that we sowed. This is false. Something else happened. I'll be happy to talk about in the question and answer session. I have worked on social history of the 19th century and institutional history. What I can hint to you is that it has less to do with ideology and religion and science and more to do with politics, systems of patronage, systems of institution, and so on. That's what was transforming in the 19th century. And if the answer, if the illness is something else than what we have been told, then the cure must be something else too, right? If this is the clash between rationalism and traditionalism, then surely something else needs to be done. But if this is something that's to do with institutions and politics and society and culture, then something else needs to be done. What I'm trying to tell you is that the past and the narrative is very different from what we have been hearing. Let me read this quote to set my point. You might be wondering, last thing you'll be wondering about, I'm sure, is why do we have this narrative, this story about the decline and so on. This is a quote from one of my favorite scholars who's not in my field, Sheldon Pollock, who is the Arvind Raghunathan professor at Columbia University, and he wrote this article called Forms of Knowledge. He's talking about Indian and Sanskrit, so he's not talking about the Muslim world. And he's reflecting a certain way things were done and the way things were written that goes for Chinese history, for Japanese history, and so on and so forth, and Indian history, and actually Islamic history too. And this is what he says. I'll read this in full and then I'll end. It's not as if we don't have the materials to make serious sense of culture and power in early modern India, 1500 to 1800. In the sphere of imagination and its written expression, South Asia boasts a literary record far denser than all of Greek and Latin medieval European culture combined. And he means in quantity, because we haven't studied it. We don't know what's there. But it certainly can pass judgments. For the Islamic tradition, certainly, as I've shown you, I've studied some of this stuff, and there's daunting amount of material out there. I cannot do this in 10 lifetimes. I cannot get through this stuff. I need teams to do this. Anyway, to go on. With respect to science and scholarship, in-depth research on most disciplines is virtually non-existent. Again, the requisite materials exist in abundance, but whole libraries of the manuscripts produced over the following 3 centuries remain unread today. The factors contributing to this indifference would be worth weighing with care. One is certainly the diminished capacity of scholars today to actually read these materials. In my field too, Islamicists don't read logic. I mean, it's gone. And if you go, as I've mentioned, if you go to the Sunni world and so on, you cannot find scholars who can read this anymore. So it's there, but we don't know what's there, right? One of the little remarked legacies of colonialism and modernization. But there are other factors. These include the old Orientalist Romanticist credo that the importance of any Indian artifact or text or form of thought is directly proportional to its antiquity. The older it was, or such is the belief, the better. Equally important is the colonial era narrative of an Indian decline and fall before 1800, so central to the ideology of British imperialism and its civilizing, modernizing mission. One salient example is the disdain with which the remarkable achievements of Hindi literature and literary science were dismissed by colonized Indian intellectuals, no less by their colonial masters. It's a narrative that has spread, and I hope that it will stop spreading. I hope we'll find the real reasons for the deplorable state, and I admit it with full force and full conviction. But we have to rewrite the narrative and re-understand the problem and then find new solutions. I'll be happy to talk more when it's time for the panel, and I did it exactly in 40 minutes. So thank you.